All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton. And like I was telling you, history didn't begin on September 11th.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
All right, so that's Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, being interviewed on 60 Minutes by Leslie Stahl there. And our next guest on the show, just take that one and put it under your hat, save it for later. Next guest is Andrew Cockburn, and he is the co-author with Leslie Cockburn of Dangerous Liaison, the inside story of the U.S.-Israeli covert relationship, Out of the Ashes, The Resurrection of Saddam Hussein, co-written with his brother Patrick Cockburn, and Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy, which you've got to read. It's so good. Welcome to the show. How are you doing, Andrew?
Hey there, Scott. Good to be with you.
I really appreciate you joining us today. And so you have this piece it's reprinted at LouRockwell.com here, for one, Worth It. And it's a review of Invisible War, the United States and the Iraq Sanctions by Joy Gordon. And we talked to her on the show, and I read the book myself, but I guess I'll let you go ahead and give people sort of an overview of what we're talking about here, the aftermath of the first Gulf War.
Right. It was really a silent and very vicious war not against Iraq, against the Iraqi people. I mean, not against Saddam Hussein, because it didn't materially affect him very much, but it was the campaign of sanctions organized and directed by the United States with the British as their very helpful sidekicks to basically choke off food and medicine and everything else Iraq or Iraqis needed to survive as in any way a prosperous society. And it was very effective. It killed, as that quote you played indicated, something like 500,000 or more than, well over 500,000 children. And it really reduced Iraqi society to kind of a pre-industrial state, to a shambles, and really disintegrated the society in ways that, you know, the effects are still being felt today, along with everything that happened since.
Mm. Well, you know, it's notable the way she talks about how even after nearly a decade of near total war against Iran, the economy of Iraq still had so far to fall. And after being smashed, Colin Powell, I guess, had targeted, I know, had targeted all of their electricity and sewage and waterworks and everything else during Operation Yellow Ribbon there in 1991 that everybody fell for and cheered for. And then she talks about how Iraq was such a unique economy in that it was, the land there, since, I guess, Genghis Khan salted the earth or whatever, could not sustain this huge population. They imported 2/3 of their food from other countries. It was all based on the oil wealth, and how because unlike the blockade against Cuba, where they could still trade with the Soviets, this blockade, this total UN blockade against Iraq, prevented any country from trading with them at all, other than under the dictates of the United States and the UN Security Council. And so that 2/3 of the food being imported, it just wasn't imported. And the food that they could get, they didn't have trucks to drive it anywhere. They didn't have gasoline to drive it anywhere. They starved 1 million people to death.
Well, that's right. And, and everyone kind of supported it. Everyone said there was an amazingly little protest about it. As Joy Gordon in her book, she has a chapter on the role of Congress. Well, there was no role. There was a few brave souls, occasionally raised objections, but really no one, stood up and said, this is a monstrous crime against humanity that's being committed here. And there were some good, some groups here in the United States, like Voices in the Wilderness, did tremendous work getting in medical supplies and so forth. But overall, everyone just went along with it as this thing, as the society slowly rotted.
Yeah, well, and based on the thinnest supremacies, right? They had to pretend that Saddam Hussein was Hitler rather than just another American-backed general somewhere. And they had to pretend he was Hitler in order to justify that first Gulf War. So then how are they going to tell the people that, oh, yeah, Hitler ain't so dangerous after all, and normalize relations with him? They had to keep the thing going. And then really by the time it seemed like there was even pressure on George W. Bush when he took office to kind of admit that, you know, these sanctions over the long term, this really isn't a long-term strategy and something's going to have to be done. But, of course, there was no way Bush was going to risk leaving office with Hussein still in power. They had to go and have a war.
Well, that's right. But the thing was, it was all an exercise. I mean, the whole thing, every which way, was an exercise in hypocrisy, because they said, first of all, they said, they'd had the sanctions when Saddam invaded Kuwait. And they said, sanctions stay until Saddam is out of Kuwait. Well, by the end of March in 1991, Saddam was out of Kuwait for whatever reason, but he was that was a definite fact. So then they said, sanctions are going to stay while Saddam's in power. But then that didn't sound so good because there was no UN authorization for that or anything. So then they said, okay, we have UN authorization that Saddam has to give up his weapons of mass destruction, his chemical and biological weapons and so forth, and sanctions will stay until they're gone. So then whenever anyone asked, they said, Saddam still has his weapons. But when, as I say in that article you mentioned, which is now on Lou Rockwell, but is also originally was in the London Review of Books, I point out that when in 1997 the UN weapons inspector, Rolf Ikeas, this is what I have this information direct from him, he was ready to say that Saddam has no weapons of mass destruction. They're all gone. We've cleaned the place out. It's cool. Our job is done. And the Clinton administration panicked. They thought, oh my God, if we accept this, if we let him do this, then we'll have our fig leaf for sanctions will be gone. We'll have to drop sanctions, and then the Republicans will beat us up for letting Saddam off the hook. So their solution was to send out Madeleine Albright, once again, to say, well, it doesn't matter if Saddam has weapons of mass destruction or not. Sanctions stay while he's there, which had the effect they knew would happen and they wanted, which is Saddam said, well, in that case, if it doesn't matter, doesn't matter whether I have the weapons or not, I'm not cooperating with the UN inspectors anymore. And he, effectively kicked them out. And that was the excuse that really, that lit the fuse that ultimately led to the war. So, that Clinton, that's why, as you mentioned, Clinton bears a huge amount of responsibility for the war, the occupation of Iraq, and all the horrible death and destruction and suffering that was caused by it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure if you saw this, but just in the last week, General Shelton from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I forget if he was the chairman for the time of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he says now in his new memoir that Madeleine Albright asked him at breakfast, hey, could we just deliberately fly one of the no-fly zone planes low and slow enough over Baghdad to get it shot down to justify a war?
Well, exactly, and people, George Bush suggested later on sort of something similar to Tony Blair, and all the press said, oh my God, says how wicked George Bush was and everything, but there's Madeleine Albright, still cavorting about, and, no one not enough people held her up as a war criminal, which, in my view, she definitely was and is.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just talked with Robert Pape about occupation causing suicide terrorism and how the title of Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against America was titled against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. Well, what were they doing there? They were enforcing this genocidal blockade against Iraq. We're going to pick that theme up here on the other side of this break with Andrew Cockburn on Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, we're wrapping up Anti-War Radio here. We got Andrew Cockburn on the phone. He's the author of Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy. And he's got a piece in the London Review of Books, that's lrb.co.uk.